Hello and welcome to episode 109 of Linux Dev Time. I'm Joe.
I'm Omeleth.
I'm Kevin.
And I'm Andy.
Good to talk to you all again. Something I've been thinking about recently is that clearly you need to be able to write good code to be a successful developer, but you also need to learn a lot of other skills like people skills, time management skills, office politics, that sort of thing. So I was wondering to what extent you lot think that that is important versus the actual coding part of things.
I very much agree that that's a huge piece of developing the, I guess, quote unquote, soft skills of developing. One, being able to just articulate your ideas to someone other than yourself is a very important skill because a lot of times it's how you either fight for your position or articulate something to that other developer to implement that you may not be implementing yourself. It's a big deal that I think a lot of projects, or at least open source projects, suffer with.
I was about to say it's more important than coding, but I think that a level of coding ability is needed to do a coding job, right? So if you assume that, then I do think those other skills are more important than coding. The way I would try and justify that is to say, unless you're doing a project on your own and no one else is ever involved, it's more important that you don't mess up everyone else than that you do your bit okay, right? And so I guess this is like the opposite of the 10x coder myth, right? I'm saying basically the most likely effect you can have on your team is to just completely mess it up so nothing works and no one does the right work or things go wrong in terrible ways. So just the ability to get on with your colleagues, and that includes clear communication, but it also includes listening and you caring about them as humans is incredibly important skill for a coder.
There's a blog post that was written, I believe, in January of this year, and it was, I don't remember the title, called something around the lines of Rust burnout is a serious problem. And it was talking about the actual people on the Rust project itself, not just people developing in Rust. But I thought it was a really good article because it kind of describes how you get into open source or start a project because it's something you like, it's something you want, it's solving a need for you. And then you kind of get sucked into all of the additional stuff. And then you feel like you almost can't leave. But a lot of times it's like the issue triage, the responding to PRs, the trying to onboard new developers, there's all this stuff kind of surrounding. And before you know it, you realize I'm not actually even working on the things that I want to work on anymore. And you're just kind of stuck in this mire. And that's what leads to a lot of burnout. So I wonder how often that's happened to other open source projects where they start something for themselves and then eventually just kind of realize, oh, I'm also doing like all of the project management stuff too. And that's taking up all of the time from the thing that I would argue we all enjoy. And that's the actual development piece of it.
That's interesting that you should talk about that, Kevin, in this context, because I think quite a lot of people who are into writing code and a lot of people who are involved in open source projects, even if they love working with other people, like I do, they also often find it quite draining. So if you go into things like issue management and stuff like that, what you're actually doing is dealing with other people and seeing things from their point of view and helping manage their disappointment or in all that kind of stuff, which can be incredibly draining and lead to burnout, especially if you weren't expecting to have to do it or you kind of don't see it as the job that you took on or something like that.
And then I think there's also the other like physical piece of it too. A lot of these things are done asynchronously through typing, which is also the main medium by which we do the profession of developing as well. So there can be things like wrist pain, joint pain, finger fatigue from just typing all day long. And I've felt it before where, you know, responding to a long issue that already has a lot of comments, it's physically draining as well. And not the like manual chopping down a tree style, but it's something that still contributes to that sort of mental load, mental factor.
Well, that makes me think about taking care of yourself, taking regular breaks, going for a little walk, getting proper sleep. All that must be important as well, surely.
Very much so. But I think that's also like sometimes it's hard to remind yourself to do that or to step away, especially, at least for me personally, when I'm right in the middle of either the actual development and solving an issue or even just writing out my thoughts on a topic. Sometimes it's hard for me to pull myself away. Now, when I tell myself to step away, go take a walk, exercise for a little bit, I always, I would say borderline 100% of the time, come back at it better. But it's still, when you're in that moment, it's sometimes very difficult to pull yourself away. So I've heard of techniques like setting a timer or something that you just can't ignore, stand up and go do something. But it can be difficult.
But if you're right in the middle of something when that alarm goes off, the temptation surely is to finish the thing real quick and then an hour later you're still doing it.
Exactly.
Yeah, I do think there's two different types of kind of zone here. Like, so when I'm just absolutely flowing and the code is coming out of me and it's right, then I kind of will allow myself to, like, I don't know, not go to the toilet even though I need to go to the toilet or whatever, like just go with it. But if you're glued to the keyboard because there's some stressful people stuff happening, then stepping away is massively helpful. But also, if you're really stuck, sometimes I will find myself metaphorically pounding my head against the screen. And if I go and make myself a cup of tea, quite often I come back and sit down and it's like, oh, actually, maybe I could do it this way.
I'm curious, have either of you ever experienced the dreaming about code and like coming up with a new way? Maybe it's not even the actual problem, but it's almost like your brain trying to figure it out in a very abstract, non-real way. And then you wake up and you're like, oh, I think I've got a way to solve this. But just that act of like getting away from the problem. And this could be something other than code too. It could just be the dealing with a long comment section or dealing with a PR or a new way or a new angle to go at that.
I have absolutely gone to sleep on something and the next day randomly realized the solution while I'm doing something completely unrelated, like making my morning coffee. And that's always a wonderful experience.
Yeah, I did once have a dream about category theory when I was doing my maths degree. Category theory is just the most awesome maths topic. I know it's strongly related to computer science, but the category theory I did was nothing to do with the computer science stuff. It was just purely this incredibly abstract maths topic. And I had a dream that all the people in the world were categories and all the relationships between them were morphisms. And I understood everything. I could see it and everything made sense to me. And by the time I woke up, I couldn't remember how it made sense. But
yeah, that's like the great symphonies that I've written in my dreams. And I wake up and it's like, no, can't remember it at all. Am I right in thinking, though, that to be a successful developer, particularly in open source, you need to learn these other skills of community management to some extent? Because until your project gets to a point where you can start hiring people or people will volunteer to do those roles, it's not good enough to just say, oh, I'm not very good at that stuff. You need to learn that stuff.
I don't know if it's exactly mandatory. There are projects out there that don't accept any contributions at all. But I would say if you do want to accept contributions, and I would assume and categorize most of open source, then those things are, if not mandatory, whatever that step right below mandatory would be if you want to have a vibrant and healthy community. I guess that's the key word there, the healthy part of it.
I think it depends on your role and it depends on your goals. So if your role is like starting a new project and wanting it to be big, then absolutely, like it's more important. Like obviously you need to produce code that works, otherwise no one will help. But as soon as your project's more than 2 people, then that stuff about can I get on with people and all those kinds of skills become at least as important as writing the code. But if your goal is just never to, just to write some code, put it on the internet, well, then you don't need those skills. But I think it partly depends, Joe, what you mean by not having those skills, right? So because if by not having those skills, you mean you are terrible at relating to other humans, for example, then that's as much table stakes as being able to write code, in my opinion. Like if someone is terrible at relating to other humans, then the project is a disaster, even if they're not the leader, if they're just involved.
Which is all too common in open source and development generally, I assume.
The way you relate at work is different from the way you relate in most open source projects. But the fact that you need to relate and work together and actually need incredibly rich communication between people to get this ultra complex thing that you're building to make any sense is true in all contexts.
Which I think is funny too, because text is so hard. I mean, I know we have so many other different ways to communicate via video chats and voice and everything, but text is still by and large the most used, I would assume, based on no statistics ever. And it's so incredibly hard because you can't capture any of those nonverbals. You can't capture really a large percentage of human communication. So the thing that is the worst at translating what we mean is also the way that we use the most. So I think some people actually might just have I won't say a bad reputation, but it's not that they necessarily are bad at the skill. It's that it's not translating through the one medium in which they're communicating to everybody else, i.e. text.
Yeah, that's why you should just send voice messages to people and definitely not annoy them.
Imagine if every contribution to your project came with a voice message.
Strike that from the record.
So some people find different types of communication more or less draining. So do either of you find video calls draining or non-draining or what?
I don't know that I find video calls draining, but I find them less productive. I think it's better in the communication aspect, but I think video calls have a tendency to drone on longer than they need to. Once the communication has happened, people are just kind of sit there like, well, what should we talk about next? We're already here. And they lead off into other stuff. So I don't know. I have mixed feelings.
I think the higher fidelity mediums like video calls and phone calls are definitely more effective and communication is clearer through them. But personally, I do find them more draining because I'm very much an introvert and more social interaction is more tiring. And I very much appreciate being able to have textual conversations because it lets me, I think we've mentioned it before, async communication lets some people take the time to craft their message and get their meaning across in a way they might not be able to very clearly in face-to-face interactions.
Some people, when they're stressed in the immediate situation, they're under pressure to respond, then respond in a really unhelpful way, and it would have been better to do it by text. It's so complicated, this. I'm basically all about in-person interactions. I love it. If I get to sit together with someone and write code at a keyboard, I'm just in my happy place. But trying to recreate that in video calls, I find incredibly draining. It's taken me years since COVID. I was already using video calls a lot before that, but then when everything was online, I just hated it. And I've slowly got to the point where I can interact with colleagues and actually enjoy it over a video call, but I still just wish I was sitting with them, really.
I think I've had a little bit of both ways. And I've also had instances where I definitely prefer the opportunity to write out my thoughts clearly, concisely. I'm probably an over-editor. I will edit my thoughts in the comment, and I also can be long-winded when I'm typing. So I prefer that method. However, there have been times where I'll write out this really, I will say, elegant response, and then someone will happen to either call me or for whatever reason we'll either have an in-person or we'll be on a call for something, and they'll say, hey, what was it you were going to say? And I'll say in about 2 sentences, kind of the gist, and they'll be like, oh, okay, great, and move on. So I've had other times where I'm like, oh, I spent a lot of time on that and I probably could have accomplished it in just a quick call. But I also obsess over, what's the context? How are they going to take this? Am I getting the right tone across? Those sorts of things.
Yeah, but those couple of sentences probably came out fluently because you'd thought about it for ages and written the really elegant thing.
I hadn't thought about that before. That's actually, I'm gonna use that next time someone says this.
That's probably true. But also, those couple of sentences contained a lot more meaning than the text potentially, the different types of meaning.
And there was probably also a little bit of back and forth where if they had a question, it was very quickly responded to in that's a minor part, or that is another big piece too when we're talking about these soft skills and responding to sometimes what can be interpreted as somewhat hostile communication, even if it's not intended that way from the sender. Sometimes you read it and it comes across a little hostile. Yeah. It can really, really help to hop on a call or even just one of my old colleagues used to preface a lot of their messages and say how passionately they were about their message. So just like in parentheses would say like, I'm not passionate about this at all. And then it would go off and say the thing. And that takes a little bit of trust to know that they're telling you the truth. But that also really helped to know like, oh, okay, I'm reading some maybe aggressive language, but this is not something they actually care about. This is just something that they, this is the way they happen to type it out.
Tonal indicators are often helpful in text, like the /s at the end of messages that are sarcastic, for example.
Yeah, we have built some tools for making text communication a bit richer, haven't we? We haven't even talked about cultural differences in this, and that's so massive in any form of communication, but especially in textual communication. People come across so differently just with different cultures.
Okay, this episode is sponsored by 1Password. Imagine your company's security like the quad of a college campus. There are nice brick paths between the buildings. Those are company-owned devices, IT-approved apps, and managed employee identities. And then there are the paths people actually use, the shortcuts worn through the grass that are the actual straightest line from point A to B. Those are unmanaged devices, shadow IT apps, and non-employee identities like contractors. Most security tools only work on those happy brick paths, but a lot of security problems take place on the shortcuts. 1Password Extended Access Management is the first security solution that brings all these unmanaged devices, apps, and identities under your control. It ensures that every user credential is strong and protected, every device is known and healthy, and every app is visible. 1Password Extended Access Management solves the problems traditional IAM and MDM can't touch. It's security for the way we work today, and it's now generally available to companies with Okta and Microsoft Entra, and in beta for Google Workspace customers. So support the show and check it out at onepassword.com/LinuxDevTime. That's onepassword.com/LinuxDevTime. Quick bit of admin then. First of all, thank you everyone who supports us with PayPal and Patreon. We really do appreciate that. If you want to join those people, you can go to linuxdevtime.com/support. And remember that for various amounts on Patreon, you can get an advert-free RSS feed that includes either just this show or all the shows in the Late Night Linux family. And you also get quite a lot of episodes a day or so early. And if you want to get in contact with us, you can email show@linuxdevtime.com. So what about time management then? That has got to be really important with open source.
Well, I think one of the hardest things is that you can't control an all-volunteer force. And so if we're talking about other people, that can be a challenge, especially if someone comes in enthusiastic, says, hey, I want to take on a thing, and then they don't produce a thing. It can be difficult because you don't necessarily want to take that away from them or hand it off to somebody else. At the same time, if you're trying to make progress and it's on your critical path of things that you're trying to get done, that can be an awkward situation to be in where you kind of prod a little bit and say, hey, what's the status of this? And those are skills that are, I would say, not even super widely well done in the professional setting either, because that can be an awkward conversation with people.
Yeah. How's the new website going, Emily?
It's coming.
Soon, TM.
Yeah.
So on the team that I'm on at the moment, I've come in and I've become like Scrum facilitator, helping us like organize our work. And whenever I do roles like that, which I've done at various times in my career, I always feel a little bit like an imposter because it's not code. I basically feel like I ought to be just writing code all day. And that's what I love doing. But in this particular team, what we desperately needed was to be more organized. So I do get to write plenty of code, fortunately. But people have said the most valuable contribution I've made so far is around the organization, which makes me feel terrible because I ought to be like a genius coder, right?
Yeah, but then they did put you in a team of people who knew about encryption.
Yeah, so like they've got large brains, yeah.
And I think we just talked about managing team time or other people's time potentially, but even managing your own time can be a struggle. And even if it's just a for fun project or something you're just putting out there for the world, being able to not only make estimates, which humans are notoriously terrible at, but also just be able to know when you're making progress, when you're getting stuck, and also not burn yourself out. I think that's a huge piece right there. Like being able to manage your time, and like we've mentioned before, being able to step away for a little bit. That's part of managing your time, is leaving yourself some open space where you can get away and treat yourself correctly.
Amalith, you work on a completely distributed remote team.
Yes.
Where you can pretty much make your own hours. So it must be really important for you to actually plan out your time and stuff. Or do you just do it whenever?
This is not great. I struggle massively with personal productivity and motivation to get things done. I think it's part of having ADHD. I don't know exactly what causes it, but I still don't have a great way of managing it. And I find it very difficult to push past not wanting to do the thing and do the thing anyway.
I do as well. Obviously not for development, it's producing these shows. But yeah, I sometimes find it really difficult to start the edit because I just cannot be bothered. I'd rather just play darts or whatever. But having goals and having a schedule and knowing I have to get this show out by Thursday, I have to get that one out by Sunday, whatever, forces me to be motivated, I think.
So maybe I should try to adopt a schedule.
I think you should, yeah. I think you should set goals and set a schedule. I'm going to get this done by then and just stick to it.
The other thing that's really helped me, because I've suffered from a similar thing, is to start with the thing that you can finish the quickest. So even if it's just a very small task or something very, very minor, you do that one thing and then your brain kind of gets tricked into this mode of like, oh, I'm working now. And that can help. And sometimes it's a little bit of push through it, but just sometimes that little act of accomplishing something or getting into that mode and getting something done, that really, really helps push me into that mode.
I have noticed that once I get started, it's easier. It's just pushing over that hump that's hard. So it sounds like reducing the size of that hump is a good strategy, and I'll try that too.
It's interesting because I think the thing I've noticed recently about my motivation is about imposter syndrome, basically. Quite often I find myself sitting at the keyboard thinking, you can't do this. You're going to fail. Everyone's going to realize you're useless. And then I end up doing some other task like email or something like that. And then I feel like, I've had a productive day because at least I was like working all day, even if I wasn't doing the thing I need to do. And then I feel more stressed because it's like, you can't do the thing you need to do. And what I have found helps with that is writing any code. The reason why I love coding is because it makes me feel like I'm powerful. I can make things.
You can control the computer.
Exactly. You can make it do things. So yeah, even if I'm doing something that's not work, like I won't do that in work time, but if I've been writing code the night before instead of sleeping, then I have a much more productive day the next day. And I noticed the other day I had there was a conference on, Matrix conference, and I was watching videos of the Matrix conference and just doing a bit of coding here and there in between. And there was no pressure on me in my head to deliver any work that day because I was busy with the conference. And I got loads done because I just lifted the stress. So yeah, I need to find a way around that.
You mentioned something a second ago, Andy, about imposter syndrome. And I wonder if lots of either video calls or just asynchronous work back and forth and away from in-person has increased that at all. I mean, I don't know how we would even study that, but the fact that we're only seeing the produced artifact of an unknown amount of time, I think contributes to this imposter syndrome where someone uploads an artifact and all we're left with is like, wow, look at this amazing piece of code. Or maybe it's terrible and you have to review it. I don't know. But you're left with the end product or nearly so, and you don't see the struggles, the typos, the absolutely wrong idioms that they went through first. Yeah. And it's only by those like in-person ones where you can see your idols or whoever, even just colleagues, making the exact same mistakes that you make. And I wonder if this kind of isolating feeling it adds to that at all. And open source is prime for that.
Absolutely. And I find also in-person helps me in another way, which is that if I have a conversation with someone and they're friendly and they treat me nicely, then I feel like they probably value me as a person or maybe even as a coder. And it just helps fight that feeling that you're just useless and everyone hates you.
Yeah, and that goes both ways. If you have the skills to be able to do that for other people and motivate them, then your whole team can be lifted up.
Yeah, I remember one particular team I was in where we had a really, really hard problem to solve. Everything was a disaster, but the team itself was really good at supporting each other. We felt like we understood where we were going. We knew that the people trusted each other, and it was one of the most fun teams I've worked on, even though we were right up against it in terms of what we were facing.
So clearly, all of these skills that we've talked about are really important. But I think that it is important to remember that the actual coding skill itself is also very important. I don't think you can make up for being bad at the coding bit by being good at the other stuff.
Not in a coding job, but in a software development organization, you need a lot of people who don't necessarily need to be able to code.
Oh, yeah.
I was reflecting on, while he was speaking, on Linus Torvalds, because he got himself into the position he was in by being excellent at writing code, but very rapidly he became a project manager of a large and increasingly large project, and it's been incredibly successful. And then you might say, well, despite problems, but then you might say, well, hold on, actually, maybe its success suggests that he's better at organizing people than we sometimes give him credit for, and then he's learned from his mistakes, so maybe he's doing a good job, I don't know.
But people who are good at development are not necessarily good managers and vice versa. And you have to have some understanding of development to manage developers.
I do agree with that.
But just because you're an amazing developer doesn't mean you're going to be a good manager.
No, and sometimes it feels like they pull in opposite directions.
That's why I like the organizations that have the parallel tracks for people that want to be an individual contributor and just continue along that career path and continue to grow rather than stacking management on top of the IC role where, yeah, exactly. Just because you're an amazing developer does not necessarily mean you are an amazing manager or that you even really want to be a manager. So those organizations that allow those kind of parallel tracks and allow you to follow whatever you're best at or whatever you want to be best at, that's something that I would like to see adopted at even more companies.
Absolutely. But I would also like to see management taken seriously as a profession with training, especially if you're going to turn developers into managers, which a lot of organizations do, for better or worse, pretending that you can just kind of bodge your way through it without learning how to do it seems like a mistake to me.
Well, do let us know what you think about all of this, show@linuxdevtime.com. But we'd better get out of here. We'll be back in a couple of weeks. Until then, I've been Joe.
I've been Amalith.
I've been Kevin.
And I've been Andy.
See you later.